Thank you. Good morning. It's so good to be able to worship with you this morning. I've really just been grateful to be here and for your hospitality this morning. My name is Addie Gildner, and I am entering into my second year at Nazarene University, and there I'm studying pastoral ministry. This summer, though, I've been interning at my home church, Flint Central Church of the Nazarene, and it's just been a wonderful experience to be able to take what I've learned at school and apply it to ministry this summer. And in just 2 days, I will embark on my journey back to Trevecca, which I'm very much looking forward to. Originally, though, I had planned to go back later in August. However, this past week, I was asked to come back early. I was quite excited to be asked because that means I could spend more time with friends who were already there and have more time to settle in. But that would also mean, with just 1 week warning, that now I have 1 week to try to work things out with my job in Flint, figure out travel plans, and also coordinate that with my family members who are also trying to figure out their own travel plans. All of this was happening while I was still waiting on confirmation about moving in early, and that communication was pretty slow. My brain felt scrambled this week, and suddenly it hit me that I still have people that I want to say goodbye to and lots of packing that still needed to be done. And I was waiting on the responses of other people. This full reliance on the communication of other people is not easy, and it leads me to feel out of control, even though it was a situation that I got myself into. Waiting on answers is not easy, and this feeling of being out of control is not fun. And I wonder what things might feel out of control for you. For me, at this stage in life, I find myself worrying about life post-graduation right now. Where will I live? Who will I marry? Will I pastor right away? Will I go to grad school? And despite, again, these questions being about my own life, I feel out of control and uncertain. For others, maybe today you brought in things like sickness or relationships, family dynamics, finances, maybe a job or school, the loss of people that you love. Those can be things that we seem maybe helpless to. Well, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip with my youth group to Panama. This trip would have been my third time going back to Panama, so by this point, I had friends and places that I was really excited to go back to. Our group, we had prepared and spent so much time on missions training and fundraising and prayer just for our trip together. Students had testimonies prepped, sermons ready to be preached, songs ready to be sung, and it was going to be an incredible week. So one very early June morning, we set out for Detroit Airport with our team of about 30 students, and we were so excited and filled with anticipation for the week of play, service, laughter, and just the group bond that comes with things like that. We boarded our first flight to Newark, and our first flight was already fulfilling these desires that we had had. It was a time of goodness and laughter as a team. But that was until we heard the announcement that our plane was being rerouted because of the storms. Us teens just figured that the adults would handle it and that they'd be able to work something out. Because obviously, if this trip is for us to serve, then God would make it happen, right? Well, we were rerouted to Buffalo, New York, a quite smaller airport with what we later learned had no available flights to Panama, and actually no available flights back to Detroit. We were completely and utterly stranded. Our suite leaders spent the whole night trying to find a way to get us anywhere, but there were no flights. Again, we were stranded. It didn't make sense. We were a group of teens who were ready to serve God and neighbor, but we were without our luggage, without change our clothes, maybe worst of all, without our toothbrush. And here we were sleeping on the airport floor. We were experiencing really strong feelings of disappointment, sadness, and for some, fear of what we were going to do next. We were completely out of control in this situation. And I think it can be easy for us to grasp for anything when it feels like we are drowning because of a lack of control. Maybe we take control over money, work, food, or maybe like me, you like to clean the house when things feel out of control. It's easy to resort to things because we know them. We can trust that they will stay the same. The dopamine hits will still come, the shopping packages will still arrive, and the house will look so much cleaner, and finally things feel restored to what they should look like. Yet, despite these momentary grasps of power, we are still feeling powerless. So today, we're going to look at a story in the book of Exodus. Exodus establishes some of the earliest stories for the history of God's people in the Old Testament. It follows the Israelites who lived in slavery and oppression under Egypt and their journey to the Promised Land, and as a freed people also, so that their deliverance might point other people to God. So let's take a moment to read our passage. It's found in Exodus 14, starting in verse 10. Starting in verse 10, it says, "As Pharaoh drew closer, the Israelites looked back and saw the Egyptians marching towards them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, 'Weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the desert? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt like this? Didn't we tell you the same thing in Egypt? Leave us alone. Let us work for the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die in the desert.' But Moses said to the people, 'Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You just keep still.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to get moving.'" I love this text. It's beautiful. But the Israelites, as we see, are a prime example of people who are feeling completely out of control. Pharaoh has kept all the power. And I think we see some of that today. All throughout humanity, there's been this deep desire to be delivered from such oppression and brokenness in the world. We live in this strange time between understanding a promise from God and that being made into a full and complete reality, and that can be hard. The Israelites, as we see, are people who have been enslaved, oppressed, heavily mistreated. But in God's redemption plan, God sends Moses, an unlikely hero, to lead the Israelites. God sends Moses to fight for the freedom of God's people, leading them into a series of plagues and struggle with Pharaoh. And after the final plague, God leads the people on a journey, on a route that would actually offer them more protection. God provided a pillar of fire and cloud as they journeyed. And finally, the Israelites are free from their oppressors, the people who have enslaved them for so long. And I wonder what might have been on the hearts of the Israelites. Were they eager with anticipation for their new journey? Were they relieved to be free from enslavement? Maybe they were planning the new layout and decorations of their homes in the Promised Land. Perhaps they were scared to leave everything that they once knew. After seeing God work in such mighty ways on behalf of the Israelites, we think the transition would be smooth for Israel. But as we know from our texts, they were scared and they were doubtful. They looked back and saw Egypt marching near. Egypt with 600 of their finest chariots, big, strong, and mighty, with all of the power and control, versus Israel, with essentially no weapons and souls that were just weary from bondage. An army that has never been in a battleground is faced with this full military power of Egypt. This is a people group that is completely out of control. They're trapped between the sea, the wilderness, and Pharaoh's army. I think if I was watching this scene play out in a movie, I would just have to close my eyes because it feels so unbearable to watch. So we can't really blame the Israelites for their fearful response to what they see, right? They would rather surrender than fight this battle. And in just an instant, they can let go of this promise made by God if that means going back to something that they tangibly understand and know, even if that means going back to a place of enslavement. In verse 12, we see that the Israelites say that it is better for them to die than to work for Egypt than to die in the desert. They're implying that they will die. They feel completely assured that death here in this desert is the only option if they don't return immediately. It's here in this tension of being trapped and out of control that they forget the mighty acts of God, who just moments before was present through a pillar of fire and clouds, and a God who saved them from the slayings of their firstborn. I'm certainly thankful to have people in my life who helped me remember God's faithfulness. Within my own life, God has guided and protected me, and sometimes I can't quite grasp those moments or movements of God because I'm so caught up by my own struggle or desire for control. But I'm thankful to have mentors and pastors, friends, family, and they have all been wonderful blessings as they remind me of the patterns and movements of God. And I wonder who that might be for you. When I was 9 years old, I started ushering at Flint Central, and I was paired with a sweet lady, and her name is Miss Jean. Miss Jean is humble, generous, and just a warm presence. A few months ago, I attended a visitation for her daughter who had unexpectedly died. After losing both her husband about 8 years ago and now her daughter, I expected her to speak with a lot of grief. And though she was grieving, she spoke not primarily about her grief, but about God's faithfulness. Miss Jean has lived in the faithfulness of God, and when things get hard, she can rely on the moments in the past in which God has been faithful. And this, not just this, but her articulation of this is also inspiring for others who may not be able to see that in the moment. This text tells us that Moses was the person who reminded the Israelites of God's goodness and protection. See, Moses has lived in the goodness of God, and he does remember. If we look at his life from a bird's eye view, from his birth to his calling to witnessing signs and wonders, Moses definitely has a lot that he can say about the character of God. Moses can direct the people because he knows God. And because Moses knows God, he knows the character of God. He knows that he serves a God who delivers. Verse 13, as we continue reading, looks at this idea of standing firm, or standing your ground, as we read earlier. This does not mean that he wanted the Israelites to passively wait. Rather, he tells the people to stand ready to observe the salvation that God is about to work for them. They don't need to create more chaos by returning back to Egypt or trying to brainstorm all the ways to fight back. Rather, Moses knows the character of God. He trusts that God is a God who delivers his people, and the people don't need to rescue themselves. Rather, God does the liberating. And if this wasn't enough persuasion for the people, Moses continues on. He tells his people to be still. And when I first read this, I found it a little ironic. The people are about to die by this upcoming army, and they're being told to be still. But actually, when you look at the Hebrew translation, Moses is telling his people that they need to be at rest or to keep quiet. There is this expectation of the coming salvation of Yahweh. Again, this isn't a call for passivity, and we know that the people will have to do something. They will have to move, and they won't just be magically carried across the Red Sea. However, there is a need for silence. And I wonder if this silence is a way for God to speak, and by having a quieter heart posture. By having this, the people can better anticipate and respond to whatever it is that God might do. When looking at this text, most translations end with this section with the words of Moses. But I also want us to draw our attention to verse 15. The Lord has something to say too, and he instructs the Israelites to get moving. God's response is to move, to be still in the knowledge, yes, of who God is, but that also prompts action. We already know the character of a faithful God. Well, I never fully finished my story about what happened following our canceled flights, but about 24 hours in the Buffalo airport, we got word that we were going to be picked up from the airport by members of our church and driven back to Flint. After another hour of coordinating drivers, it was going to be another 6-hour wait for drivers to arrive in New York. And this news was a big bummer. We had been holding out hope for so long that somehow things would work out and there would be a flight that would get us to Panama, but that was not the reality. To be honest, we were grumpy, we were in need of a shower, and tired, and I can recall tears being shed from both students and leaders. But I want to focus on a response much greater that I witnessed. After receiving word that there were going to be drivers coming to pick us up, we got our final snacks from the airport store, which I think we kept their business going for weeks after our stay, and we collected our luggage from the baggage claim. As the luggage slowly came out, I was reminded of the ways each of us had packed with just this anticipation of the week. We were ready to use our minds and our bodies to serve God. It was really unfortunate that in just a few hours we'd have to go home and unpack that. But as the luggage continued to go out, I watched my friend grab her guitar. And moments later, she opened it and began to play some of the worship songs that they had prepared to lead in Panama that morning. Friends started to gather around and started to sing the worship songs with her. Eventually, the whole team gathered around, praising a good God in the Buffalo baggage claim. The student who was going to preach in Panama led us by preaching in that space, and he shared his testimony of God's faithfulness in his life. And there were not many dry eyes there that morning. While strangers in the airport came and lingered around during both the worship and sermon, we never really got to talk to them. I would love to be able to tell you that through worship that morning, a stranger in the airport gave their life to Christ, but that I do not know. But I believe that when God's people show up faithfully, we can trust that God is actively at work, and this is really good news. When I read verse 15, this response comes to mind. We were upset and sad and completely out of control, but we still have a response. We knew who God is, and that led us to a posture of worship that morning. Trying situations can become opportunities for the people of God to trust God, to witness the Lord's power at work, and ultimately to make a way when it seems like there is no other possible way, and ultimately for God to reveal his glory in the world through those who trust him. If we think about rain for a moment, we have a complete dependence on rain. We need it for the survival of ecosystems, crops, and nourishment, yet it's something we can't control. There are seasons where a lack of rain can be absolutely devastating to crops. It's not easy to wait when things are out of our control. But putting our trust in a God who delivers, again, is not always something that feels easy. It might feel like there are seasons of intense drought, yet those seasons still play an important role in the testimony of God's presence and faithfulness in our lives. Throughout the Old Testament, God repeatedly taught his people to trust him. One of the ways he did that was through practicing the Sabbath. Sabbath is taking time to intentionally stop from work and to rest. For a society who depended on daily labor to survive, stopping required lots of trust. They had to believe that God would provide even when they were not working. And we see the same lesson in Exodus as God provides manna in the wilderness. If people tried to gather more than God had instructed, it would rot. The Israelites were learning what it means to depend on God, one day, one meal at a time. The writer of Hebrews picks up on the same theme. In chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, it says, So you see that a Sabbath rest is left open for God's people. The one who entered God's rest also rested from his works, just as God rested from his own. Therefore, let's make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall by following the same example of disobedience. Sabbath reminds us that we are not sustained by our own strength, but by God's faithfulness. It reminds us that our lives are not held together by what we do or our ability to control every circumstance. And thanks be to God for that. Our lives are held together by the God who provides. And this truth is still good news for us today. Whenever we choose to rest in God instead of carrying every burden ourselves, we are practicing trust. We are declaring that God is faithful. God will provide what we need, just as God always has. And I wonder what it would look like for us to stand firm today and to be still. We know who God has been in the past, so that is who we trust with our present and our future. The things we talked about earlier, there's sickness, health issues, family dynamics, finances, careers, school, loss. Those are not getting a final say, because we trust in and we worship a God who delivers us through the droughts. We can trust that God is above all things, and we do this because we know the character of God. We can place our hope in a God who is making all things new. So for those of us who are standing at our own Red Sea today, we are maybe unsure of how God will make a way, but we do know God's character. God has been faithful before, he is faithful now, and he will be faithful again. So our response is to stand firm, to be still, and when God says move, we obey. Let's go ahead and end with a prayer this morning. Father, thank you for this time this morning to be able to be still in your presence, to worship and praise you, and be reminded of who you are. We come before you today recognizing that you are Lord and we are not. We release to you whatever it is that we are trying to take control over. We ask that through your power you deliver us from the bonds and chains of sin and brokenness that we might be experiencing. Would you help us trust you because we know who you are? Would we become people who can bear witness to where we see you at work? God, we trust that you will reveal your glory in the world. We trust that you are actively delivering, and we hope for the day where this brokenness will be made whole. This can only be done through you, Lord, but may we be active participants in joining the work that you are doing. Thank you for your love and your grace for us, Father. Amen. Well, as we go from this place this morning, I pray that this week you will find ways to see the faithfulness and movements of God in your life, and that you will be able to find ways to faithfully respond to that. Go in peace.